So now we are live and I don't see any attendees. Oh, here comes some folks. Good evening to those of you joining us tonight for this Housing and Health Speaker Series. We just launched the webinar and folks are still coming in the attendance room. So I'm going to give it just a couple more moments before we kick it off and let everybody get comfortable, get your sound adjusted, get your drink in order, and we'll launch here in just a moment. All right, well, we are a little bit after 5:30 and I don't want to keep anybody from this beautiful evening, so I think we should go ahead and get started. Welcome, it's good to see so many friendly names and I wish I could see your faces on this online discussion about regulations and administrative processes and how they relate to affordable housing development. My name is Becky Gray and I serve Chaffee County as the Director of Housing and I will be your host this evening. This event, as many of you know, is the last public education event for the Housing and Health Speaker Series that occurred over the last 2 years. But don't worry, the Housing and Health team is preparing a grant application with the goal of continuing this type of community engagement through 2025. So keep your fingers crossed, and to keep an eye on that upcoming grant-funded activities, you can visit the Housing Health Chaffee website at housinghealthchaffee.org. The Housing Health Speaker Series has been funded through Colorado's Health Disparities Grant Program. It's being administered jointly by the Office of Housing and the Chaffee County Department of Public Health. There are many links between housing stability and the overall health of our community and our people, and this program is intended in part to highlight those connections. I'd like to offer gratitude to Andrea Karlstrom, Lisa Martin, Heather Gorby, Ryan Sailors, Dale Shoemaker, and Janie Hayes, who make up the Housing and Health team and have been instrumental in the execution of these events. Thanks so much, team. I want to mention that we are recording this tonight, and if you or any of your friends want to watch it later, you can find it on the website I mentioned earlier. You will also find videos of Chaffee County residents telling their experiences with housing insecurity, a Housing 101 booklet full of definitions and acronyms, updates on the Janes Place development, which is a 17-unit plan development in Salida, and information on advocacy efforts and how you can participate. Again, that website is housinghealthchaffee.org. We're once again back on Zoom on this platform to host our discussion. And for those of you who maybe haven't Zoomed with us before or become Zoom experts over the last year, I'd like to highlight a few of the features we'll be using tonight. As audience members, you are all muted, which simply means that if you talk, we won't be able to hear you. However, there is a question and answer feature on Zoom. So if you have questions during the presentation, you can ask them by clicking on Q&A at the bottom of your screen, type in your question and hit enter, and the questions will come to me. Once our guest has finished her presentation this evening, I'll ask the questions on your behalf. So jump on in the discussion and just ask away. Another Zoom feature that we'll be using tonight is real-time polling. So I am going to launch the very first poll right now. And you should be seeing a poll on your screen, just one question this time. Your answers are anonymous, but it will help us meet our grant reporting requirements, and it will help us inform how we continue these conversations in the future. So as soon as I see that all of our participants have been in the poll, I will end it and we'll get on with our evening. Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It looks like we have a few newcomers tonight, and predominantly people who have joined us on this housing and health journey. I appreciate that. Now on to the main event. I am pleased to introduce AJ Fawver, who is the community consulting planning leader for Verdunity and is based in Lubbock, Texas. Her prior experience includes 15 years of municipal experience in key planning and development leadership roles for the cities of Lubbock, Amarillo, and San Angelo. She is accredited through the American Institute of Certified Planners, the Congress of New Urbanism, and as a certified public manager. AJ is director of the Northwest Texas section of the American Planning Association. In addition, AJ is a 3-time honoree on ELGL's Traeger list, a ranking of the top 100 local government influencers, and was a recipient of the APA Texas President's Award in 2017. She's appeared on many podcasts, including the Go Cultivate podcast, where she co-hosts, are we doing this right? An excellent podcast series. AJ speaks regularly at conferences on topics such as diversity and inclusion and neighborhood planning. Her blogging includes the past series, Planning and Shaping Cities, and her current series, Future Proofing Cities. So with that, I will turn it over to AJ, and welcome to virtual Chaffee County. We're incredibly glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Becky. I appreciate the warm welcome, and I'm so happy to be here to talk with you all tonight about an issue that's at the forefront of everyone's minds. And Chaffee County has had an impressive track record in really elevating this conversation and inviting others into it. Something that I hope that we can do in many other communities. So my focus for tonight's discussion is to talk about regulatory barriers to affordable housing and help you understand how the simple process of crafting our codes and regulations in communities really has a drastic effect on the type of housing products that are offered. So the subtitle for tonight's discussion is the connection between what we require and what we desire. And I found that to be very fitting because often when we're putting together these types of tools in communities, they come from a place of protection, an intentionality of creating consistency, uniformity, and trying to think of any negative impacts and try to head those off. That's generally the mindset most of us are in when we're crafting regulations. But there's much more to this effort that I think cities can learn from and infuse into their decision-making process and their discussions with the community to make them more robust and avoid unintended consequences. So the first picture that I always bring up when I have these discussions is the proverbial iceberg. So we've all heard the phraseology about the tip of the iceberg, and this is particularly true in this type of discussion. Everything above the surface is really what we're focused on, and again, those intentions that we talk about when we're formulating policy for the areas in which we live and work. But we tend to forget at times about everything below the surface, which is often much larger than what our focus is. And below the surface, there are a number of things that we need to keep in mind. And the biggest one of those is unintended consequences. We're going to talk tonight about a number of ways that typical city approaches to codes can have the unintended consequence of creating barriers for affordable housing. So first, I want to talk for a moment about housing products. I know that there are a number of housing products that we're all very familiar with and that you see across the nation, but the conversations about product types is really changing, and it could come at a better time. What we're finding is that there is a renewed interest in communities to create what we refer to as missing middle housing. And if you followed this speaker series, I feel quite confident that you've already heard some mentions of missing middle housing, but I continue to use the graphic because it really is the best graphic that I found for conveying the information. When we look at city regulatory codes, we usually find that housing really falls into one of two categories: the traditional single family detached model and something much more intensive where we think of the apartment complex as an example. Very few cities and counties truly have regulations that embrace the full spectrum of what's between those two bookends. And those are shown here on the slide. So some of these are fairly historic approaches to housing that we're seeing have a resurgence. And those are things like, for example, the courtyard building or the cottage court approach. We're also seeing that there are a number of things that are variations on the live work model that we're seeing come back. And some of the cities that we work with here in Texas, for example, we've seen the live work unit take a new approach. Whereas traditionally live was on the second floor, work was on the bottom floor, we're now seeing some experimentation in ways that make not only the housing affordable, for example, housing in the rear and the business in the front, but they also play a key role in cultivating a local business and contributing to that local wealth, kind of growing from within the community idea. We also see a number of new types of housing units that are starting to emerge in different communities, such as the micro unit, the tiny home, which of course we're all familiar with if we watch HGTV. But outside of that particular presentation of that product, it is something that can be used both in the formulation of a community or a courtyard type of approach or standalone. We've also seen in our work a resurgence of something that we refer to as the roommate house, which is this idea of private rooms within a shared structure. It can be a home, a traditional single family home that's converted perhaps, with shared common facilities. And then last but not least, I always want to mention the modular home, which in previous years has had a bad rap and there is a stigma associated with it. But I think we always have to be looking at how new materials and building approaches to these types of products really change the way that they appear. And typically when we're talking about trying to place alternative housing models in our communities, we're really focused on the idea of something that fits in nicely to the existing fabric of that community. And the good news is there are a number of products out there now that do a much better job of doing just that. So I'm going to run through a number of features that are typically part of any zoning subdivision ordinance or unified development code is another approach to this. And we'll talk about some of, again, the unintended consequences that come from these types of regulations. So I start with numerical standards. All zoning codes have numerical standards in place, which do things related to the lot itself or the building site. Generally, these numerical standards place limitations on the size of the buildings. They can either be maximums or minimum footprints. Lot setbacks are another feature that you may be familiar with, both in the front and perhaps side and rear setbacks, and then the size of the lots themselves. So the graphic here on the bottom of the slide simply shows this idea that by taking the same amount of land and looking at it in a variety of different ways, we can customize the amount of density that we feel is appropriate for the community and best accomplishes our goal, in which case we're talking about making those units affordable. Now, these are just two options. And with every community, we always say it's really incumbent upon that community to have these conversations openly to understand what fits them best. So let's talk a minute about the minimum lot size. Again, a common feature, but unfortunately, what we see too often is minimum lot sizes often preclude the construction of affordable housing products. Well, why is that? Well, typically minimum lot sizes are much larger than the traditional lots that make up the core parts of our communities. And there is intentionality behind that. When you see an entirely new subdivision go in, it probably doesn't seem unusual. However, what we see with affordable housing is that it's a great tool to activate infill parcels within your communities that are currently unused. And infill parcels are typically found within existing neighborhoods, and they're remnants or single lots that have not been constructed on. What happens is the identification of those lots can lead a developer to approach a community, perhaps with an idea to build an affordable housing product. But the first barrier that they will have to contend with is the understanding that the lot size that is required in today's world in their community may be much larger than what they have to work with. So understanding that and allowing for smaller minimums for lots really activate pieces in your community that might otherwise be overlooked or forgotten. And it is definitely in the best interest of the community to have those be productive and part of the tax roll, generating tax base. Lot setbacks is another feature that has changed over time. And if we want to have more affordable housing products, we have to think about our approach to this and perhaps rethink it. Lot setbacks, particularly in the front, made much sense around the post-World War II area when we saw people really experiencing a lot of their life on their front porches. And the culture has shifted and we don't see that type of community within neighborhoods anymore. What we tend to see is people that generally use their rear yards for more of those activities that perhaps historically might have been in the front of their home. Now we're a society of backyard living with our pergolas and our grills and our swimming pools. So the excessively large front yards are not something that is necessary at this point in time. So it might be a good time to reconsider that. Taking remnants of lots and trying to activate them to allow places for affordable housing to thrive means revisiting those regulations to make sure that those remnants can actually be utilized. We also have to have regulations that do not limit our ability to work with unique limitations or needs. These types of unique limitations can be something along the lines of topography, for example. They might be unusually shaped lots. And typically those processes in cities require, for example, a variance process where a developer must approach the approving agency or the agency in charge of considering their application and go through a lengthy process where there may be a certain standard of law that has to be met in order to justify doing something differently. The good news is communities, as they're crafting their codes or re-examining their codes, can very easily build in intermediate steps that can help eliminate some of those lengthy processes. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. Uses and building types are also a key part of zoning that we have to think about, again, in a different way as we consider affordable housing. The number one thing to consider is the single-use zoning district, which really became prevalent mid-century, but we're starting to see that go away, particularly with examples like the city of Minnesota, where they've actually abolished single-use, single-family residential zoning. Now, that is an approach that may not work for every community, and that's certainly fine. But re-examining how we've allocated the land within our city's footprint is crucial. We found that most communities use between 80 and 95% of their footprint in reservation for only one type of development, and that is the traditional single-family home. Here's an example from an article that was written by the New York Times in 2019, where they looked at a series of cities and did the math to see how much of their footprint was allocated towards this one use. And here's an example from Arlington, Texas, which was 89%. And this is very common in cities of all sizes. So what we've already done is we have drastically reduced the ability for anyone to come in with affordable housing products because we've allocated the lion's share of our footprint to one thing only, and that doesn't always lend itself to diversity in housing affordability or in housing products. And those things, of course, work together. Another thing that we see frequently is, in addition to the lack of land that's reserved for something other than single family homes, we also see that what is left over is not always placed appropriately. And for affordable housing to truly take hold in a community and thrive, it needs to be placed in areas that have close proximity to alternative modes of transportation, that have the accessibility to major employers or goods and services that are within an easy walk, for example. Those are the areas where affordable housing thrives most. And therefore, it begs re-examination of making sure the areas we've allocated for those truly are placed in a way that makes sense. Some cities use tools like planned development districts and other zoning tools that allow a negotiation of sorts and the use of conditions to really tailor and customize a zoning product. And unfortunately, when we see those used, they often require very large acreage in order to use those zoning tools. So at times, those are the only flexible option, but it's less flexible wholly in part because it requires a large amount of raw land. And that, of course, works at counter purposes with the development of affordable housing. Another thing to ask is the strict limitations that you have on things that are alternative housing products. So for example, the accessory dwelling unit or the auxiliary dwelling unit is a discussion that many organizations and many communities are having right now because they understand that that is a type of affordable housing product that brings gentle density to neighborhoods without fundamentally changing the character or the functionality of them. Design standards at times can be barriers instead of facilitating development. And so that needs to be re-examined as well. So a few examples I've included throughout the presentation here, just so you can look at how other communities are doing these things and perhaps take some lessons from them. So on the slide here, I've highlighted two different projects, one in Portland and one in Spokane, Washington. These are large communities. However, the principles are things that can really be utilized in communities of any size. So for example, in Portland's residential infill development project that they've been working on since 2017, they really set out on a quest to re-legalize that missing middle housing that we discussed in a moment ago. And so how did they do that? Well, the first thing they did was they understood what the need for housing was. They did a study and determined how many additional units they would need in order to accommodate the growth of their community, which they were expecting to jump by 2035 by 100,000 additional housing units. Because of their footprint and the way that they are situated within their state, they have very little room to grow outward. And so it became an examination of how to best use the resources that they already had. And that was lots that were fully served with infrastructure. So here's a number of things that they did on the graphic. They re-examined how they looked at parking. We'll talk about that in just a moment. The accessory dwelling unit question I spoke about a moment ago was a big part of their conversation. They also reduced their maximum building size requirements. That was one of the numerical standards I spoke about a moment ago. And what they did, if you look at the graphic here, is they realized that the lots that existed and that were intended for single family homes needed to be re-envisioned in order to fit other types of housing products, such as duplexes, cottage clusters, or townhomes. So they're a good example of a community that set a goal for affordable housing and then immediately outlined how they plan to make that happen and updated their policies to match. In Spokane, their regulatory updates really focused on a cottage housing type of idea where they could actually fit several smaller units on typical sized lots. They understood that during this process, they would have to work closely with other departments such as public safety, looking at emergency vehicle access, re-examination of how buildings fit the street. And they wanted to make sure that these neighborhoods were also walkable. So those were all factors that they included. So I mentioned parking a moment ago, and parking requirements are generally one of the most prohibitive things that can be a barrier for affordable housing projects. Again, the intentionality is not to be a barrier. The intentionality, of course, is to make certain that everyone has adequate space for parking. However, the way we go about that has some unintended consequences. The amount of land that's required for parking in many projects is often what eventually makes that project either exorbitantly expensive to complete, or in some cases, it may kill the project altogether. Again, when you're really focused on trying to use the resources that you have within your community and create infill development, it's very difficult to assemble the amount of land necessary to meet the parking requirements. And truly, the number of spaces required in most zoning ordinances is something that's looked at universally. But we know from studies and from observations that affordable housing doesn't use parking with the same aggressiveness that a traditional single-family subdivision would. That can also limit your site selection. And as we discussed earlier, site selection is really crucial to making sure that affordable housing is going to be successful. The other thing to keep in mind is that the more parking is required for a project, it starts to trigger other requirements, such as fire code, where emergency egress for fire trucks, for example, can make what starts as a small parking area a much larger parking area. So let's look at this in practice. This is an example from the greater Denver area, and a group called Shopworks Architecture did a re-examination. They actually published it just earlier this month, where they looked at 19 projects that they had put together for affordable housing projects over the last 6 years. And they compared the number of parking spaces that were required for those projects with the number of spaces that were actually used after many years of that affordable housing being in place. And it just shows the resource constraints that could be better utilized. In this particular case, they found that $9.2 million of funding had been spent on parking that was not being utilized. And that essentially would have been the equivalent of a 40-unit affordable housing building. So again, we have to ask ourselves, is what we require truly matching up with what we desire to have in the community? We also have to talk about not just new construction when it comes to affordable housing, but the ability to reuse facilities and communities. This is something that we're seeing with great inventiveness and, of course, a great eye on utilizing codes and ordinances in a way that meets the intent, but maybe doesn't meet the letter. And so one thing for cities and counties to keep in mind is that as they're enforcing their building and fire codes, they do have a great deal of flexibility and latitude when it comes to the interpretive abilities that they have. Most cities and counties around the nation are now adopting international codes that are standard, and there's reasons for that. However, for other reasons, there are always built-in ways that that city or county can make it local amendments to those codes in order to make sure they have the flexibility to meet their intentions. So, for example, a lack of mixed use zoning is something that can be detrimental to this whole notion of reuse. And that's something that can be looked at in a zoning code as well as part of a building code. Here's some examples where they've done a great job of being inventive and looking at their codes and creating some products from buildings that otherwise were sitting vacant. And so I'll start on the top of the slide here, where in West Virginia, they transferred the use of a school to an affordable housing complex. Next to that is a bank that was converted to mixed income housing in Ohio. And along the bottom of the slide, you can see a number of other types of conversions. In California, they had an existing office building with a surface parking lot that was being completely unused. So to be creative and maximize the use of that land resource, they converted the office to affordable housing and built on top of the parking lot an addition to that building. Next to that is a project from Fort Worth, Texas that's currently under construction where they're converting a church to affordable housing. And then lastly, there's an example from Branson, Missouri, where they're converting a Days Inn to an affordable housing complex. So again, making sure that our codes and regulations meet the intent of what we're trying to achieve, but also allow for this type of ingenuity and innovation is critical. So let's talk for a moment about clarity and regulations. Even the experienced developer can go into communities and find issues with the lack of clarity in regulatory tools. They're not always written to be user-friendly. They're often looked at as a scholarly exercise and a legal document. But we know that in order for people to bring alternative types of housing products to our community, that is not something that we've seen a lot of, we have to make certain that people that have that desire can understand what is required of them and that those requirements, of course, are not barriers. Being able to understand the regulations themselves can often be a barrier. They can basically require the need for interpretation. And unfortunately, this can create many issues. With every staff size, you're going to have a number of people that are all responsible for applying those regulations. And so it creates a difficult situation when developers are approaching staff to ask them for interpretations, and those interpretations are not always perhaps consistent. It can also lead to a habit of asking multiple people within the organization to compare the responses to decide how you want to proceed. But really, we should make this much simpler, both for the people applying the ordinance and the people that are being expected to follow it. And clarity is an important thing to have there. What's also important to understand is once you've really crafted language that you feel is exceedingly clear, there will always be situations that present themselves that you might not have thought of at the time that the code was written. And so a best practice to use here is having official written interpretations when those interpretations are needed. Those are documented that way. They are then consistently applied by the staff. They are consistently understood by the community. And it's always a good idea, I find, to keep those throughout the course of the year and make an annual exercise, making amendments to your code to finalize and formalize those interpretations. That also can have an effect of inequity, and that can also negatively prevent this idea of affordable housing coming into your community. And there's often a lack of tools to simplify these regulations, and that's something that every community, every organization can do something about. So when looking at a code update, some of the things that are typically overlooked but are really the most important are the definitions section and the use of graphics, such as the graphic shown on the slide here, that very clearly demonstrates how the numerical standards in that ordinance are measured to the ability for anyone to look at this and understand exactly how it's applied. Flowcharts are another great piece that can be utilized. Processes are often viewed as very cumbersome, and while there are good reasons that those processes are generally in place, they can be made simpler. And so it's really critical that anyone approaching an agency seeking approval of a project, especially if it's an affordable housing project, something you're trying to encourage, that they can understand the process and navigate it easily and clearly. So let's talk about infrastructure for a moment. These are often features of a subdivision ordinance, and that's not something that most people are typically very interested in. But I think what we need to understand is that the subdivision regulations are truly laying out the design of your community. And so whether it's a desire to have more walkable space or to have less dead-end streets or to have a sense of connectivity within your community, all of those things are dictated by the subdivision regulations. One thing that we see across the nation, still very common, is the requirement of unnecessarily wide streets. And when this happens, that can be, again, something that makes a smaller project cost prohibitive. And it can also create other types of issues. For one, the conveyance of drainage is something that can be exacerbated by requiring something wider than necessary. Requirements for increasing infrastructure or updating infrastructure as part of a basic replat is another thing to consider. In many cases, affordable housing products are being placed on lots that were created long ago, and they may require things like lot splits or lot combines in order to make that building site sufficient for the project. And these are typically paper exercises, but they can turn into very costly exercises if there are requirements for infrastructure to be increased at the time a replat is done. So it's really important for the different agencies that have this regulatory authority to make certain that the regulations do give them some latitude for the types of infill development that they're seeking to bring into their community. If that is truly a goal for the community, then there are administrative types of processes, for example, that can be written into the code that avoid costly hearings, notifications, and things of that nature, but really outline a set of principles by which a project can be viewed and can be analyzed and perhaps approved. Basic replats I've seen in many cities have also triggered things like dedication requirements. And again, when you're dealing with infill development, any dedication may be something that suddenly becomes a larger issue that's quite problematic and or lengthy. The prohibition or limitation of situations where cul-de-sacs can be used is another thing to keep in mind. So cul-de-sacs can be an effective tool, particularly when you're putting together subdivisions where geographic or topographical constraints prevent a street from being a through street. However, when that's not necessary, it can have a whole host of other impacts. One of those is cost. Obviously, the construction of a cul-de-sac is going to result in pavement maintenance that is really the requirement and responsibility of that city or county in perpetuity, even though we know that those cul-de-sacs generally will not see much traffic. Another thing to keep in mind is the connectivity of our areas. So many communities come to us and ask how they can infuse walkability within their existing neighborhoods. And that's difficult to do on a retroactive basis, particularly when cul-de-sacs are present in the subdivisions. We have a graphic, and I wish I dropped it in here, but it is a great illustration because it shows a single home in a subdivision that's approximately a 3-block distance from a school. However, the subdivision uses a number of cul-de-sacs. So the actual distance to get to that school is tripled in length as opposed to a neighborhood that has high connectivity, short block lengths, and many streets that intersect, which means you have a number of choices in order to get to the same place. And so that's something to keep in mind. Specifically with affordable housing, again, we want to be able to offer transportation alternatives. Long block lengths is something that can also negatively affect that sort of approach. And we do tend to see this more in the traditional suburban style development that many cities, especially here in Texas, have perpetuated. And now we're seeing the results of that type of development pattern and seeking to do something different. I mentioned building and fire code requirements a moment ago, and I wanted to come back to that for just a moment. These are examples of things that I've actually seen in cities that have essentially deterred really good affordable housing projects. The first one is the application of the international codes for buildings. Um, in many cities, we see that anything that is 3 units and up has to meet a certain set of standards. And when we started looking at the bigger picture on some of these codes, what we found is that whether it was a 3 unit development, a 30 unit development, or a 150 unit development, all of the requirements were exactly the same. And so we're treating projects that are much different, just like the large apartment complexes in many cases. So that's something to keep an eye out for and to examine as you're updating your codes. There often is a prevalence of consideration for existing limitations. So we know that when we're trying to see buildings become retrofitted, or we're trying to build within spaces that are leftover lots or forgotten areas of our community, there are limitations in place that may be difficult, if not impossible, to make fit the same clean, neat, and easy type of developments that can occur with raw land. And so that's another important consideration, is to ask yourself, the litmus test really is, are we treating and therefore somewhat disadvantaging these smaller type developments by treating them the same as the larger ones? We talked about the importance of interpretations, and again, that applies here as well. And we've also seen that there can be conflicts between codes. And so it's important that those conflicts are known by the staff, that there's an awareness about them, and if they can't be addressed immediately, that at least there's a decision on what will be the deciding and determining factor. So those conflicts can be between a building code and fire code, for example, or a subdivision design code and a fire code. That's something we see often. We also need to make sure that interior or internal remodels are not unnecessarily complicated. So on all of the reuse projects that I showed you a moment ago, the one similarity between all of them, with the exception of the office building conversion that had an element of new construction, was that they were all utilizing the footprint as it existed of that building. And they didn't make material changes to the exterior, as you could see. So those were fortunate, a series of events for those particular projects, but in many communities, just the remodeling of the interior of a building can become unnecessarily complicated. And so that's important to look at in advance, understand, and create a path forward that's clear. Processes are also a critical part of our regulations, and processes are necessary. Of course, there has to be some level of oversight and checking to make sure that requirements are met, specifically as it relates to public safety. However, we can get in our own way when it comes to processes. Number one is having multiple points of contact and multiple points of entry into a process. So really the best practice here and what we recommend is to try to create a single point of entry into a process. And if you can, have a centralized point of contact that can guide that developer through the process from start to finish. Being able to enter that process from many different points creates confusion for the applicant, as well as for the people that have the task of regulatorily applying the restrictions in place to that particular project. The same applies to multiple agency reviews, and these happen in every community and every county. It's important that there is a careful choreography of how those entities work together, and that they are looking carefully to identify any redundancies or overlap. Also, processes can be overwhelmingly lengthy, and that is inadvertently punitive for projects. It also is an artificial limitation to the pool of potential developers that could bring these types of products you're seeking to your community. And what I mean by that specifically is, think about the costs, for example, that are incurred when a process just to break ground and receive a building permit takes several months. there are very few people that are equipped to deal with the carrying costs, for example, month to month. There are a number of hidden costs that have to be borne by the applicant as they're awaiting approval. And so we are inadvertently limiting ourselves to a very small pool of developers, and generally your development community that's building these affordable housing products is a different developer type than the developers you see bringing the new construction and subdivision construction into your communities. Typically, they are smaller in size in terms of their companies, their staff sizes, and their budget. And so we want to make sure we aren't inadvertently punitive when that happens. The other thing that's important to understand with the processes being lengthy is it can often take a hit to their financing that they're trying to secure for the projects. Getting financing on something that you don't have all of your approvals lined up for yet can be very tricky, and again, can unfortunately limit or cut off the ability for that project to survive. So what is the path forward? Well, I think it's important to link two different things in this process. And one is the understanding of what you seek to accomplish, and very specifically so, and then the alignment of your policies with that desire. So here's an example of a community that I think that's done this very well, the city of Colorado Springs. They put together a very clear and very specific community housing plan that looked at several different levels of affordable housing and got so specific as to identify percentages of their housing stock that needed to fit within those categories. So they understood at the beginning specifically what they were trying to achieve, and the characteristics of each of those classifications. The provision of financial assistance or incentives, of course, is always an approach. But again, that is best done once there is a housing plan in place. There are a number of other policies that can assist in this process. Land banking is one of those, which, just as it sounds, is the banking of vacant pieces of property in a way that those costs can be driven down, because the procurement of the land is greatly simplified. They also put together a housing task force, and this is something I've seen in many communities that's very helpful. Typically, when you're looking at updating your codes and requirements for certain types of development specifically, it's crucial to have input from those communities because they will see things that you might not otherwise see and identify. And there has to be, of course, this educational pursuit of letting people understand what affordable housing is about, how it affects the community as a whole, and addressing the stigma that unfortunately still exists in many communities towards this type of housing. Some other lessons that cities have shared is to not only make affordable housing affordable on the front end, but to maintain that long term. And there's a number of tools that can be used to accomplish that. Review the areas where your affordable housing can be placed in your community. So when you're updating regulations, it's really important to do that in the context of the overall plan for the community. So just as in Chaffee County, you have a comprehensive plan that's going to essentially lay out that vision, and your ordinances should follow that. It's also critical to re-examine your land use earmarks for affordable housing throughout your community at the same time, and make sure that those pieces work closely together, and to look for underutilized spaces that you might be able to bring into that program. Here's some other examples I wanted to leave you with. It's always helpful, I think, to see what is working in other communities. And we always joke in government that there are very few original ideas, and that's okay, because when there are original ideas that work really well, sometimes they can be co-opted and perhaps modified and used in your own community. So here's a list of some of those. I already mentioned the Colorado Springs example. In Boulder, they put together a toolkit of different housing options and types. That's a very useful tool to entice people that would bring pieces of the housing puzzle to your community that might not otherwise consider you. In Longmont, there was a change to their ordinance, and this is something I always highly recommend, where they looked at creating modifications that could be administratively approved by the staff and avoid the long hearing process. There are some other examples here where they've looked at expediting the processing of permits for affordable housing. That's more of an incentive type approach. In Denver, the parking minimums, we mentioned that a moment ago, that have been re-examined. In Costa Mesa, California, and Tucson, Arizona, they actually took this a step further and created a different set of regulations for what they're calling small lot subdivisions. And this was again done in the context of affordable housing. And so there's a number of ideas here that I think are all very interesting. Some of them will work in your community, some of them may not, but they're all a great starting place. And so to sum it up, again, we really need to make sure when we're crafting these regulations that we're thinking about what are we trying to achieve? What is it that we desire? And do our requirements truly open the door and eliminate barriers for the things that we desire? You'd be surprised how many times the answer to that question may be no. The good news is it's something that's totally within your control, and that you as a community can really take a cohesive look at and hopefully see the number of affordable housing opportunities in your community expand and grow as you move forward. I'll end here with my contact information. I'm happy to talk to anyone that would like to reach out. And if you're watching this recording and not watching it live with us, feel free to reach out with any questions that you have at any of these contact methods, and I'd be happy to respond. So Becky, I will turn it back over to you.
Yay, round of applause for AJ. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for putting such a complex topic into really digestible pieces. I appreciate that very much.
Sure.
And I do have a couple questions coming in. For those of you who are joining us tonight, again, please feel free to hit Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type in some questions, and I'll include them in the list that I have in front of me. First, I wanted to mention the report that you cited regarding parking. I have a copy of that locally. If anybody on the call wants to have a copy of it, just reach out and I would be happy to email it to you. It was from the Denver metro area, but I do think that a lot of the findings are very applicable for the rest of the state and probably the rest of the nation. So like the example that you shared, AJ, in I think it was Portland or Vancouver, Chaffee County has very limited room to grow as well. 80% of our land is publicly owned, and the 20% that's privately owned is quickly being developed. How does a community maintain the feel and look of its neighborhoods when adjusting those numerical standards that you started with to increase density? How can you still maintain the vibe, the quote unquote feel that we are accustomed to when you do that?
I think there's a couple of approaches to that question. Number one, I think, is really getting an understanding of the fact that while we have historically crafted these regulations to apply universally to our communities, they don't necessarily have to. You can utilize tools like identifying character zones, for example, or creating overlays. There are tools that allow you to customize the approach to the specific parts of your community where you think that that might be possible, and to likewise provide protection in areas where you think something may not be the best place to experiment. So that's one approach, I think, is to really get specific about where the areas and pockets of opportunity are and focus on those, because we know that this is not a battle that's won overnight. The second thing I would say to that, in addition to having that type of approach to it, is to understand that all density is not created equal. We, talked for a moment, I mentioned the abolition of single family use zoning in some cities. And let's be honest, most communities are not there and they're not ready for that. And that's okay. But there are several steps that you can make that are in between where we are today and something that's that game changing. So one thing that we like to advise communities about is think about the next increment up from what's allowed there and maybe start there. So if you're looking at areas where you have that single family detached pattern, consider the tools of like the accessory dwelling units, the micro units, or perhaps even authorize things like a duplex. Allow 2 units per lot instead of the 1. And right there, you can start to see a change. Now, of course, everyone's not going to do that, but it's important to have that conversation, I think, in the context of the other effects that come from it. So when we talk about things like 2 units per lot, one of the things that we always talk about is the ability, the enhanced ability for your residents to age in place when you have that type of ability. It's an affordability issue at times, and a second income stream can help with that. Sometimes it's just needing to have someone close enough. If you need assistance with something, this can assist with that. So I think it's not just about the number of the units on the lot, but also the societal impacts of that. And the next thing is, everyone always says, well, what about parking? And so I think when that question comes up, there has to be a discussion of, that's a grounding discussion about parking. So in some of these communities that I've mentioned, because they are landlocked, of course, they're facing that issue as well. But most streets and many of our communities are already wide enough to accommodate on-street parking. And on-street parking is not the end of the world. And so, I think we have to kind of fundamentally ask ourselves this question of, are we trying to create communities for cars, or are we trying to create communities for people? And we may not get everything, but that prioritization and maintaining that prioritization with these discussions, I think grounds the conversation where it can be much more productive.
I like that. Remember the priority, remember our goals. That's the key. Our communities have largely embraced accessory dwelling units. They're fairly common here and growing rapidly, but this is the first time that I've heard reference to the roommate house. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and if it can also fit into single family zoning in homes that might be retrofit. Could you expand on that a little bit?
I'd be happy to. That's where we've actually seen that happen most of all. We work with some small developers in our work, and a couple of those small developers, well, one in particular that I'm thinking of, works in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and he works specifically in impoverished neighborhoods. And that is one of the models that when they first came up with the idea, the city said, no, that's not something that our ordinance permits. But once they started working through it and they understood the intention of it, they decided to try it. And it became something that worked out really well for people from an affordable housing standpoint, because it worked well for people that were, for example, singles that didn't have children. They needed access to those common areas, but they didn't necessarily want to maintain those on their own. It allowed them to take some houses that were actually slated for demolition and retrofit those where they could work. So the concept is just, again, you have a shared kitchen, shared living space in terms of living room, television area, and then the landlord actually rents the rooms. And so that's an approach that can work quite well. It really is about meeting the needs of your population, though, and in that particular neighborhood, it worked well. In another neighborhood, it might need to be a different type of model.
I think you maybe were talking about Monty Anderson when you were talking about the roommate house. He was part of a guest of ours on the speaker series as well, talking about incremental development. One of our audience questions is, do you have any thoughts on addressing NIMBYism when it comes to increasing density and bringing in these kind of mixed use proposals?
Yeah, you bet. having spent so much time working for cities, that was something that I dealt with almost on a daily basis. And what I've learned over the years is, number one, people's objections are not always what they say they are. We have to be really good at listening. And so what I've found is when you start to facilitate conversations where people can express their opposition to these things, um, number one, you can do enough listening that you start to see that the objection is actually something fundamentally different from what you're talking about. And the longer that conversation goes and the more heard those people feel at times, the more you can have a productive conversation and help them get to the heart of what the issue actually is. So I think we have to be understanding to an extent. I think another thing that's helpful is getting ahead of that in projects. Some of the developers that I've seen do more innovative development the best are very savvy about understanding exactly where the roadblocks are going to be from a perception standpoint, and taking the time on the front end to have and facilitate conversations. And perhaps this is also where, as a staff member, you can kind of be that facilitator of a conversation. And what we've seen is, there will always be some examples where people just can't get past it. But for the most part, when you have an open dialogue, there's a give and take that can occur. And generally, people can get to a point where they can live with it. Another thing is we have to remember, as human beings, we want to be heard. We don't ever have an expectation of always getting our way. I don't think most of us. And so I found that a lot of people that have been the most staunch critiquers of a project, once they were heard and they could feel heard and they could see that they weren't being pushed aside, they weren't being ignored, at the end of it, they said, you know what, we can live with this. I just needed to know that I was able to express myself. So those are a few things. You have to have your boards and commissions that are hearing these cases. They have to really have a very disciplined grip on how to conduct the meetings. The outreach is of course very critical leading up to that hearing, and often that means more than just a letter saying someone's seeking this zoning. It means a really detailed explanation where people have almost too much information, but they're not lacking something, which tends to feed that flame a little bit.
Excellent. I like that. More information and more listening is a nice approach to creating allies instead of opposition.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I
And
appreciate
as we
it.
talked about earlier, it's also going back to what are we trying to achieve here? There's very few people that are going to speak out about something when they realize that it actually flies in the face of the very thing. We can support something and also work against it at the same time. And sometimes we need to be reminded of that, that community-minded approach. And we have to decide where do we stand on it, understanding the context of how that affects our community.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, AJ. I appreciate it. We are running out of time. Actually, I think we already are out of time. I'm going to launch our final poll of the evening, also going to be a lot simpler than some of the other polls that we've had in this speaker series. And while the audience, while you all are answering that poll, I want to remind you that AJ has offered to answer other questions that might come up. So please, if you are talking about this with your family tonight on the porch in this beautiful weather after this event, and you come up with some additional questions, you're welcome to send them my way, and I'll share them with AJ, and we can even keep kind of a Q&A on the Housing Health Chaffee website for this conversation. So with that, looks like we have almost everyone completing the poll. I'm going to, let's see. While you are finishing that, I want to, on behalf of the Chaffee County residents and the audience participating this evening, thank you, AJ, for being with us and sharing your knowledge. It's extensive, clearly, and you've been very generous with it. So thank you very much for your time tonight. Thank you for the audience that have joined us this evening. And I just really look forward to continuing this conversation with you in the future, AJ, as well as with my colleagues here in Chaffee County. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good night.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.